You won't believe what happened at the grocery store. A young kid, barely out of his teens, stopped me, blocking my cart. He shouted that the expensive steaks in my cart were his and told me to hand them over. Then, his mother, the neighborhood HOA president, stepped in, pulling out her phone and calling the police on me, saying I was a threat. Everyone in the store watched, recording it all. What this woman didn't know was that the police officers coming to the scene were about to find out something very surprising about the dangerous person she was describing. I was just doing my regular grocery shopping at the fancy store on Elm Street. It's the kind of place where everything is organic, and the shopping carts have really smooth wheels that actually work. I was wearing my comfy hoodie and jeans, just trying to look like any other person picking up stuff for dinner. The store was quite busy for a Tuesday afternoon, with the usual people who shop when it's not too crowded, like stay-at-home parents and older folks. I was in the meat part of the store, looking at some really nice Wagyu beef steaks. These steaks cost more than what most people spend on all their groceries in a whole week. That's when things got weird. Suddenly, a young white guy, probably in his early 20s, just stopped right next to my cart. He was tall and looked like he worked out, with that kind of proud way of standing that you see in kids who have always gotten their way. His eyes were glued to those expensive steaks in my cart. The way he looked made me feel uncomfortable right away. It was like he was trying to figure out if I even belonged in the same area code as those steaks, let alone buying them. I kept on shopping, hoping he would just leave me alone, but instead, he stepped right in front of my cart, blocking my way. "Hey, old man," he said loudly, so loud that half the store could hear him. "Those steaks are mine. Give them to me right now." The kid's voice had that special kind of rudeness that comes from growing up thinking the world owes you everything. I felt everyone in the fresh food section turn to look at us, and the quiet talking in the store seemed to stop, making everything feel awkward. A woman near the organic tomatoes even pulled out her phone and started recording what was happening. I took a deep breath and calmly reached for an avocado, looking at it as if nothing unusual was going on. This seemed to make him even angrier, and his face started turning red. "Don't ignore me," he yelled, stepping closer to my cart. "I'm Jake Wilson. My mom is the HOA president." "You don't belong in our neighborhood, and you definitely don't belong buying food like that." The way he spoke, it was clear he felt like he was better than everyone else. It was amazing. Here was this kid, who probably never worked a day in his life, telling me what I could and couldn't buy based on the color of my skin. I continued my shopping, moving toward the checkout area, but he followed me, getting more and more upset by the minute. That's when his mother showed up, and everything got 10 times worse. Brenda Wilson looked exactly like what someone would imagine for a bossy, rich suburban mom. She had perfectly styled blonde hair, fancy workout clothes that looked like they had never been used for actual exercise, and that look of always being unhappy that you get from having too much free time and not enough real problems. She marched over to us like she owned the whole store, which, knowing this neighborhood, she probably had some money invested in. Without even asking what was going on, she immediately stood up for her son and against me. "My son is absolutely right," she said in a sharp voice. "Someone like you has no business buying food like that. Those steaks belong to people who actually help out in this community." The woman's boldness was unbelievable. She was standing there in her expensive outfit, probably driving a car worth more than most people's houses, telling me I didn't deserve to buy groceries. I noticed other customers starting to gather around, some recording with their phones, others just staring in shock at what was happening. The young person at the checkout counter looked completely embarrassed, clearly wanting to help but probably afraid of losing their job. An older man near the bakery just shook his head and walked away, while a young mother quickly took her children toward the exit. The whole scene was like something from a bad social experiment. But here's where it gets interesting. Brenda Wilson had no idea who she was really dealing with. As she kept talking loudly about neighborhood rules and proper behavior, I just smiled and kept putting my groceries onto the conveyor belt. The Wagyu steaks, the organic vegetables, the expensive wine, everything that had seemed to start this whole argument. Jake was practically shaking with anger because I was ignoring him, while his mother was getting ready for what looked like a full-blown meltdown. That's when she pulled out her phone and called 911, right there in front of everyone. "There's a threatening black man harassing my son at the grocery store," she said into the phone, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's being aggressive, and we feel unsafe." The lies came out of her mouth so easily, it was clear this wasn't the first time she had called the police on someone she didn't like. I just smiled and calmly said, "Go ahead, call them." Little did she know, she was about to learn a lesson about not judging someone by how they look, or in this case, a police chief by his casual hoodie. The police arrived incredibly fast. It was less than 10 minutes from Brenda's call until I saw the flashing lights in the parking lot. I had to give credit to my police department. They took calls seriously, even the ones that probably sounded strange over the radio. Two officers came into the store, and I recognized them right away, though they didn't seem to recognize me in my regular clothes. There was Officer Martinez, who had been on the force for 15 years and was very sensible, and Officer Smith, who was newer but very sharp. They handled the situation in a professional way, but I could see them immediately making assumptions based on what they saw in front of them. Brenda started her act before the officers could even figure out what was going on. She had managed to work herself into real tears by this point, holding onto Jake's arm like she was protecting him from serious danger. "Officers, thank God you're here," she cried dramatically. "This man threatened my son when Jake simply asked about those expensive steaks. We were just doing our shopping when he became aggressive and hostile. I'm honestly afraid of what he might do next." The woman could have won an award for that performance. The trembling voice, the protective mother stance, the perfect amount of fear mixed with anger. Officer Martinez looked between Brenda and me, clearly trying to piece together what had actually happened. I could see him taking in the expensive groceries in my cart, my casual clothing, and the fact that I was standing there completely calm while this woman was having what appeared to be a breakdown. "Sir," he said to me, using that careful voice officers use when they're not sure how a situation might get worse. "Can you tell me what happened here?" I calmly explained that I was just grocery shopping when this young man demanded I give him my steaks, and his mother showed up to support his demand. Officer Smith was writing notes while looking at the growing crowd of people watching. Many were still recording the whole thing. Jake, meanwhile, was enjoying all the attention. "He was totally aggressive, officer," he said, acting like the perfect victim. "I just said something about his groceries, and he got all angry and in my face. Mom was just trying to protect me when she called you guys. The kid was good at this. He probably had years of practice getting out of trouble by letting his mom fight his battles. But I noticed something interesting. Several other customers were shaking their heads, and I heard one older woman quietly tell her husband that the boy was lying. The truth always finds a way to show itself, even when people try to hide it with acting. Officer Martinez, to his credit, didn't fully believe the story. "Ma'am," he said to Brenda, "can you tell me exactly what threatening behavior you saw?" Brenda then told a long story about me blocking Jake's path, raising my voice, and making scary gestures. None of that had actually happened, but she told it with such strong belief that I could see Officer Smith starting to look at me with more doubt. That's when Brenda played her best card. "I demand you check where he lives. People like him don't belong in our neighborhood, and I bet he doesn't even have a good reason to be here." Her request was a problem in many ways, but I could see the officer's difficulty. They had a local resident making a complaint, saying she felt threatened and asking for what she probably thought was a reasonable check. Officer Martinez looked uncomfortable with the request, but in the end, he decided it was easier to check my address than to try to figure out the different stories in the middle of a grocery store. "Sir, would you be willing to show us your address to help clear this up?" he asked. I calmly nodded and said, "I'd be happy to show them exactly where I live." Brenda looked pleased, probably thinking this would show me as some kind of unwanted person in her special neighborhood. The drive to my house was interesting, to say the least. I drove my car, and the officers followed behind. I could see Brenda and Jake trailing along in their fancy SUV, probably expecting to watch me get arrested in front of some old, run-down apartment building. The situation was quite ironic. Here they were, following me home to prove I didn't belong, when I was actually leading them to one of the nicest houses in their own neighborhood. I had also noticed a woman in a small car following our little group, staying back but clearly curious about how this drama would end. Later, I would learn this was Elena Martinez, a neighbor who had seen the whole grocery store argument and felt she had to see how it finished. When we pulled into the driveway of my house on Maple Ridge Drive, you could have heard a pin drop. My place wasn't just nice, it was amazing. It was a modern two-story home with huge windows, beautiful gardens, and a driveway big enough for 6 cars. I had bought it with money saved from 20 years in law enforcement, working my way up from a regular police officer to a detective, then a captain, and finally becoming the police chief. The house showed everything I had worked for, and it was definitely more impressive than most of the homes in Willowbrook Heights, including the Wilsons' house, which I could see down the street. I walked up to my front gate and put my finger on the scanner. The electronic lock clicked open with a soft sound, and the automatic glass doors slid apart quietly. Behind me, I heard Jake Wilson make a sound like someone had hit him in the stomach. Officer Martinez raised his eyebrows, clearly rethinking the whole situation, while Officer Smith just stared at the house in obvious surprise. But Brenda's reaction was the best. Her perfectly calm face had turned completely white, and she was staring at my home as if it were some kind of impossible dream that couldn't really exist. "How is someone like you living here?" she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The question hung in the air like she was admitting her true feelings. Not how can you afford this or what do you do for work, but how is someone like you, meaning someone who looked like me, living in a house that was clearly more than she thought I deserved? Officer Martinez cleared his throat awkwardly, probably realizing that this police call was not what it had first seemed to be. The woman, who had seemed so sure she was right just 10 minutes earlier, was now faced with the fact that her ideas had been completely wrong. If I thought that showing where I lived would stop Brenda Wilson's fight against me, I was very mistaken. In fact, it seemed to make her even more determined than ever to prove that I didn't belong in her neighborhood. The next morning, I woke up to find trash spread across my front lawn, empty food containers, coffee cups, and what looked like stuff from someone's car ashtray. It was clearly done on purpose, arranged in a way that spelled out a rude message. I cleaned it up before going to work, but I had a feeling this was just the start of a much bigger problem. Jake Wilson apparently decided to make bothering me his new full-time job. Every day when I came home from the police station, he would be somewhere on my street, finding new ways to make sure I knew he was there. Sometimes he would be walking his dog in front of my house. The same small dog walking back and forth for 30 minutes at a time while he stared at my windows. Other days, he would set up a lawn chair at the end of his driveway with a clear view of my front door, just sitting there like some kind of neighborhood guard. The kid had turned being annoying into an art form, and he was clearly enjoying every minute of it. But the food delivery harassment was what really crossed the line. Jake had somehow figured out that he could order food to be delivered to my address using his own phone number, then show up at my door saying I had stolen his order. The first time it happened, I was confused when a pizza delivery driver showed up with 4 large pizzas I hadn't ordered. Before I could explain the mistake, Jake appeared from across the street, rushing over as if I had personally wronged him. "Hey, where's my DoorDash order?" he demanded loudly, making sure the neighbors could hear. "I paid for that food, and now you're trying to steal it!" The delivery driver looked between us, clearly uncomfortable, and not sure what to do with this strange situation. I calmly explained that I hadn't ordered any food and showed the driver my ID to prove I wasn't the person who had placed the order. Jake kept insisting it was his food, getting more upset when it became clear that his plan wasn't working the way he wanted. The delivery driver, probably just wanting to get away from there, eventually took the pizzas back and said he'd sort it out with his company. But Jake wasn't done. He started posting online about how his new neighbor was stealing food deliveries and causing all kinds of problems in the neighborhood. The posts were just vague enough to avoid clearly lying, but clear enough that anyone who knew the situation would understand who he was talking about. The woman I had noticed following us from the grocery store turned out to be Elena Martinez, and she lived 3 houses down from me on the same street. Elena was probably in her early 60s, a retired teacher who had lived in Willowbrook Heights for over 15 years. She had seen enough of Jake's silly behavior to know something wasn't right, and finally found the courage to talk to me one afternoon when I was checking my mailbox. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said quietly, glancing around nervously, "but I've been watching what that Wilson boy has been doing to you. I saw what really happened at the grocery store, and I've seen him bothering you every day since then. It's not right, but I have to be honest. Mrs. Brenda is telling everyone you're dangerous." Elena's information explained a lot about why other neighbors had been acting cold towards me. Apparently, Brenda had been going door to door, warning people about the dangerous new resident who had scared her family at the grocery store. She was describing me as some kind of crazy person who had moved into the neighborhood to cause trouble. Elena said that most people were just believing Brenda because she was the HOA president and had lived there for many years. "People are scared," Elena admitted. "Mrs. Brenda has a way of making life very difficult for anyone who goes against her." That evening, as if on cue, Jake decided to make his harassment even worse. I was sitting in my living room when I heard loud music coming from the street. Looking out my window, I saw Jake's car parked right in front of my house, with the windows down and the music turned up loud enough to shake my windows. He was just sitting there playing explicit rap music and revving his engine every now and then. When I didn't react, He got out of the car and started throwing small rocks at my front windows. Not hard enough to break anything, but loud enough to be annoying. The kid was clearly trying to make me react, probably hoping I'd come outside and give him a reason to call the police again. I was reaching for my phone to call this in when Elena appeared at my front door, looking upset and determined. "I can't take this anymore," she said when I answered. "He's been doing this for 20 minutes, and it's bothering the whole neighborhood." Mrs. Brenda called the police again, saying you're watching her family and taking pictures of their house. "I think you should know they're on their way." Sure enough, I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. Jake must have heard them too, because he suddenly jumped back in his car and drove away. But the damage was done. For the second time in a week, police were being called to deal with me, and I hadn't done anything wrong. Officers Martinez and Smith arrived, looking tired and annoyed. Clearly, they were getting sick of these calls too. But they had to respond professionally, even to what was clearly a pattern of false reports. Brenda appeared almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for this moment, with Jake behind her looking smug and pleased. "Officers, he's been watching our house all day," she claimed dramatically. "Taking pictures, making notes, clearly planning something. We don't feel safe in our own neighborhood." Elena stepped forward before I could respond, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm sorry, but that's not true. I've been watching from my window, and he hasn't left his house except to get his mail." That's when I decided this fake show had gone on long enough. I stood up straight, reached into my wallet, and pulled out my police badge and identification. Officer Martinez's eyes got wide as he recognized the ID, and Officer Smith actually took a step back in surprise. I looked directly at both officers and said in my most official voice, "I'm Police Chief Marcus Williams. Officers, you can go back to the station. I'll handle this harassment case personally." The effect was immediate and strong. You could have heard a pin drop in the sudden quiet after I told them who I was. Brenda Wilson's perfectly calm look cracked like a broken mirror. Her mouth opened and closed several times without any sound coming out, while Jake looked like someone had just told him Santa Claus wasn't real. Elena's eyes went wide with surprise, probably realizing that her quiet new neighbor was actually the top law enforcement officer in the city. Officers Martinez and Smith immediately stood up straight, snapping into the respectful position they would use with any superior officer. "Chief Williams," Martinez said formally, "we had no idea. Should we write a report about these harassment complaints?" I nodded and told them I'd handle the paperwork myself, and they headed back to their patrol car with obvious relief at being out of this increasingly awkward situation. After everyone left that night, I expected Brenda and Jake to disappear for a while, maybe to rethink and plan their next move. Instead, they showed up at my door the next morning, with what I can only describe as acting performances worthy of an award, showing sorrow and humbleness. Brenda was dressed in her most conservative outfit, a simple black dress that probably cost more than most people's rent, and she had clearly been practicing her humble apology voice. Jake stood behind her, looking properly humbled, though I could still see the anger simmering in his eyes. They claimed they had no idea I was the police chief and were simply trying to protect their neighborhood from what they thought was suspicious behavior. The apology was perfectly planned and completely empty. Brenda went on about how they were important people in the community who just wanted everyone to feel safe and welcome in Willowbrook Heights. She explained that they had been having problems with homeless people recently. She actually used that word, and had perhaps been too careful when they saw me at the grocery store. Jake added his own practiced apology, claiming he had just been looking out for his mom and hadn't meant any harm. The whole performance was so well done that I almost admired how committed they were to the lie. Even though we all knew none of it was real, I accepted their apology with professional politeness, though I made it clear that any further harassment would be treated as what it was: criminal behavior directed at a law enforcement officer. They nodded seriously and promised to be perfect neighbors from then on. Brenda even invited me to the next HOA meeting, saying they would love to have the police chief more involved in community matters. As they walked away, I noticed Elena watching from her window, and something in her expression told me she wasn't buying their sudden change of heart any more than I was. The woman had seen enough of Brenda Wilson's tricks to know when she was being fooled. Elena's growing bravery in standing up to Brenda was probably the most positive thing to come out of this whole mess. A few days after the fake apology, she came up to me again while I was working in my garden. This time, she seemed less nervous and more determined to share what she had been seeing. "Chief Williams," she said, looking around to make sure no one was listening, "I've been thinking about something that doesn't make sense. Jake drives a brand new Mustang. one of those fancy models that costs around 60. He wears expensive sneakers that cost 500 a pair. He always has the newest phone, and I've seen him posting pictures from expensive trips to Las Vegas and Miami. Elena's observations were starting to create an interesting picture, but she wasn't done yet. The thing is, she continued, Brenda is always complaining at home meetings about how little money the association has. She's constantly asking us to approve new fees and charges for community improvements that never seem to happen. Last year, she had us all vote to spend 12-0 on new playground equipment for the community park. But if you look over there, she said, pointing, it's the same old rusty swings and broken slide we've had for years. I looked in the direction she was pointing and realized she was absolutely right. The playground was a mess and definitely hadn't received 12-0 worth of improvements recently. This was the moment when Elena changed from a scared neighbor into a valuable helper, understanding what was really happening in Willowbrook Heights. She had been keeping mental notes on Brenda's questionable money decisions for months, maybe years, but had never had anyone to share her worries with. There's more, she said, pulling out a folder she had been carrying. I started keeping track after the playground incident. We approved 15-0 for security upgrades 6 months ago, but I don't see any new cameras or lighting. We paid 8-0 for landscaping improvements, but the common areas look exactly the same as they did 2 years ago. As Elena showed me her papers, a pattern became clear that was much bigger than just a spoiled kid getting expensive toys from his mother. This was a planned misuse of money from the entire HOA, with Brenda using her position as president to send community money toward her family's expensive lifestyle. Elena had photographs of Jake's car, screenshots of his social media posts showing off expensive things he bought, and detailed records of HOA spending that had been approved but never actually carried out. The woman had essentially been doing her own investigation without realizing it, and the proof was very strong. I tried to bring this up at meetings, Elena explained, but Brenda always has an explanation ready. She says the contractors had delays, or the equipment is on back order, or the work was done but maybe we didn't notice the improvements. People just accept her explanations because questioning the HOA president is uncomfortable, and most residents don't want to deal with neighborhood drama. But when you add it all up, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars that have just disappeared. That evening, I decided to do some investigating of my own. As a police officer, I knew how to look up public records, and HOA financial documents were supposed to be available to all residents if they asked for them. What I found was even worse than Elena's careful observations had suggested. Over the past 3 years, the Willowbrook Heights HOA had approved over 80-0 in community improvements that were either never finished or were so small that they were basically invisible. Meanwhile, Jake's social media showed a young man living far beyond what someone his age could reasonably afford. The clear proof came when I compared the dates of major HOA spending with Jake's social media posts. Every major expense approved by the association was followed within days or weeks by proof of Jake buying something expensive. The timing was so obvious that it would have been laughable if it weren't so criminal. Elena created a detailed spreadsheet showing how the HOA votes and Jake's purchases were connected, complete with screenshots of his posts and photographs of the community areas that were supposedly improved. The evidence was complete enough to give to law enforcement, which was exactly what we planned to do. The other neighbors who joined our investigation brought their own pieces of the puzzle. Mrs. Patterson discovered that many of the contractors who had supposedly been paid for community work didn't exist. The business licenses were fake, the addresses were empty lots, and the phone numbers went to disconnected voicemails. Mr. Rodriguez found that the few real contractors who had actually done work for the HOA had been paid much less than what Brenda reported to the members. The Hendersons found proof that Brenda had been charging the HOA for services that she was getting for free through city programs. Elena's transformation during this process was remarkable to witness. The quiet, nervous woman, who had been afraid to speak up against Brenda Wilson, had become a confident community leader, organizing a sophisticated financial investigation. She was coordinating between multiple households, managing complex documentation, and even reaching out to residents who had moved away to get their experiences with HOA overcharges. Elena had found her voice and her purpose, and it was powerful to see someone discover their own strength in the face of injustice. The most damaging evidence came from Jake's own electronic records. Elena's tech skills were another surprise. Apparently, her late husband had been in IT, and she had learned more about digital investigation than most people realize is possible. She managed to get back deleted social media posts where Jake had been even more clear about his family's money schemes, including screenshots of conversations where he bragged about tricking the neighbors and living off HOA money. The kid had basically recorded his own crimes while thinking he was impressing his friends. As our investigation went deeper, we started getting attention from residents in nearby communities who had heard about Brenda's media appearances and wanted to share their own experiences with HOA fraud. Apparently, the Wilson family scheme wasn't unique. There were similar cases in several nearby developments, where HOA presidents had been using their positions to pay for personal expenses while lying to residents about community needs. Elena was contacted by investigative reporters who were working on a bigger story about HOA corruption, and our documentation became part of a much larger examination of how these organizations were being abused. The final piece of evidence was almost too good to be true. Elena discovered that Brenda had been foolish enough to use her personal bank account for some of the fake transactions, creating a direct paper trail between HOA funds and Wilson family purchases. Jake's car loan documents listed Brenda as a co-signer with a 20-0 down payment that came from an account linked to HOA finances. His credit card bills, which Elena obtained through methods I probably shouldn't ask about, showed purchases that matched exactly with dates when HOA funds were moved into special accounts that Brenda controlled. By the time we had put all our evidence together, we had built a case that would have impressed any prosecutor. Elena had organized everything into a presentation that clearly showed the pattern of fraud, the specific amounts of money involved, and the timeline of criminal activity. We had financial records, photographs, witness statements, and even Jake's own admissions recorded during his live stream meltdown. The total amount of money stolen from the community was almost 100, over 3 years, which made this more than just a simple civil matter. It was serious criminal fraud that could lead to federal charges. The decision to take our evidence to the authorities was agreed upon by all the neighbors who had been working on the investigation. We weren't just seeking justice for the financial crimes. We wanted to make sure that Brenda Wilson could never again use her position to harm a community or use law enforcement against innocent people. Elena volunteered to be the main person to file the complaint, since she had been the one organizing the investigation and had the most complete documents. We also decided to share our findings with the news channels that had been covering Brenda's accusations against me, to make sure that the truth would get the same attention as her lies. The media's change of heart was quick and devastating for Brenda Wilson's carefully built story of being a victim. Elena had worked with the investigative reporters who were already looking into HOA fraud cases, and our package of evidence landed on their desks at the same time it was given to the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and the District Attorney's Office. Within 48 hours, the same news channels that had been showing Brenda's tearful accusations against me were leading with headlines about planned financial fraud and the downfall of a suburban criminal operation. Channel 7, the station that had given Brenda her platform to destroy my reputation, ran a special investigative report titled The HOA Scam: How One Family Stole from Their Neighbors. The report included Jake's livestream confession, Elena's financial documents, and interviews with many residents who had been victims of the Wilson family schemes. The contrast between Brenda's earlier performance as a vulnerable single mother and the proof of her planned theft was so striking that it made her previous interview look like a masterclass in manipulation and trickery. The FBI moved quickly once they had Elena's evidence package. Financial fraud cases involving community organizations fall under federal law when they reach certain amounts of money, and the Wilson family schemes definitely qualified for serious federal attention. Within a week of receiving our documents, federal agents were carrying out search warrants on the Wilson residence, Brenda's personal bank accounts, and Jake's various financial records. The searches found even more evidence than we had been able to gather as private citizens, including records of other fraudulent transactions and proof of tax evasion related to the stolen funds. Jake Wilson was arrested first, primarily because his livestream confession had made him an easy target for criminal charges. The kid who had started this whole mess by demanding my groceries was now facing federal fraud charges, conspiracy counts, and possible prison time that could keep him locked up well into his 30s. His social media accounts, which had been such valuable evidence for our investigation, became exhibits in a federal criminal case. The expensive lifestyle he had been so proud of showing off was now documented evidence of his family's crimes. Brenda's arrest was more dramatic and public, partly because she had made herself such a well-known figure during her media campaign against me. Federal agents arrived at her house during the morning rush hour, when neighbors would be leaving for work and school, making sure many people would see her being walked away in handcuffs. The woman, who had presented herself as a victim of police harassment, was led away in handcuffs while news cameras captured every moment for the evening news. Her perfectly calm appearance finally broke completely as she realized that her entire world was falling apart around her. The community's reaction to these events was a mix of relief, anger, and embarrassment. Relief that the truth had finally come out, and that Elena's investigation had exposed the real criminals. Anger at being victimized for years by people they had trusted with their community's well-being. Embarrassment at how easily they had been fooled, and how quickly many of them had turned against me based on Brenda's lies. Elena organized community meetings to deal with these feelings and to plan for rebuilding trust and honesty in their neighborhood association. My reinstatement as police chief was immediate and came with public apologies from every official who had been involved in my suspension. Mayor Davidson held a press conference to announce that the investigation had been closed and that I would be returning to duty with the city's full confidence and support. He also announced that the city would be reviewing its ways of handling accusations against public officials to make sure that future cases would be investigated more thoroughly before any official action was taken. The protesters who had demanded I quit were noticeably absent from the press conference. Elena's rise as a community leader was one of the most positive outcomes of this entire difficult experience. The neighbors who had been working on the investigation unanimously elected her as the new HOA president, and she immediately put in place measures for transparency that would prevent any future financial abuse. Elena established monthly financial reports, required multiple approvals for any expense over 1,0, and created an oversight committee with changing members to make sure that no single person could ever again control the association's money without being held accountable. The legal consequences for the Wilson family were serious and fair. Brenda eventually pleaded guilty to many charges of fraud and conspiracy and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Plus, she had to pay back the full amount stolen from the community. Jake received a lighter sentence due to his age and cooperation with investigators, but still faced 18 months in federal prison and 5 years of probation. Both were forbidden from ever holding any position of financial trust for any organization, ensuring they could never again abuse positions of trust. The money that was recovered was more than enough to finally finish all the community improvements that residents had been paying for over the years. Elena supervised the installation of the playground equipment, security upgrades, and landscaping projects that the Wilson family had stolen money for but never provided. The community center got its roof repairs. The parking lot was properly paved again, and the common areas were beautifully landscaped. For the first time in years, residents could see exactly where their HOA dues were going, and the results were impressive. 6 months after this whole ordeal began, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue in my backyard to celebrate the community's recovery and Elena's leadership. The same neighbors who had once viewed me with suspicion were now sharing stories, laughing, and enjoying the kind of community spirit that should have existed all along. Elena brought her famous potato salad and gave a toast, thanking everyone for having the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult and uncomfortable. As we were cleaning up that evening, a police transport van drove slowly past my house, carrying inmates from the federal courthouse back to the detention center. Through the reinforced windows, I could see Brenda Wilson looking out at the neighborhood she had once controlled through fear and manipulation. Our eyes met for just a moment before the van continued down the street, and I felt nothing but pity for someone who had thrown away everything for money and power that were never really hers to begin with.